French theorist Jean Baudrillard, born in 1929 to parents who were civil servants and grandparents who lived a life of peasantry, was one of the foremost intellectual figures of the present age. He was the first of his family to attend university and has achieved a momentous amount of work that combines philosophy, social theory, and an idiosyncratic cultural metaphysics that reflects on key events of phenomena of the epoch. A sharp critique of contemporary society, culture and thought, Baudrillard is often seen as a major guru of French postmodern theory, although he can also be read as a thinker who combines social theory and philosophy in original and provocative ways, and a writer who has developed his own style and forms of writing. In 1986, he moved to IRIS, Institute of Research and Socioeconomic Information, at Dauphine University in Paris, where he spent the latter part of his teaching career. During this time, he had begun to move away from sociology as a discipline, particularly in its classical form, and after ceasing to teach full-time, he rarely identified himself with any particular discipline, although he remained linked to the academic world. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, one of Baudrillard's most common themes was historicity, or more specifically, how present-day societies utilize the notions of progress and modernity in their political choices. He argued that history had vanished with the spread of globalization, but averred that this end should not be understood as the culmination of history's progress, but as the collapse of the very idea of historical progress. He advocated that what ended the Cold War was the disappearance of utopian visions shared by both the political right and left, rather than one's ideology's victory over the other. His work paved the way for the abolishment of Marxism by postmodern philosophers such as Douglas Kellner. Baudrillard explores modern systems in all of their seemingly catastrophic forms and analyzes their successes and failures. Eventually, he discusses how the modern systems end up getting lost in the delirium of their own making. In The Transparency of Evil, Baudrillard described a situation in which previously separate domains of the economy, art, politics, and sexuality collapsed into each other. Baudrillard calls this situation trans-aesthetics, which he relates to similar phenomena of trans-politics, trans-sexuality, and trans-economics, in which everything becomes political, sexual, and economic, so that these domains, like art, lose their specificity, boundaries, and their distinctness. The result is a confused condition where there are no more criteria of value, of judgment, or of taste, and the function of the normative thus collapses in a morass of indifference and inertia. Baudrillard says art has disappeared in the sense it no longer abides to the rules that it used to. Art is everywhere, but there are no more fundamental rules to differentiate art from other objects, and no more criteria of judgment or of pleasure. And yet, as a proliferation of images, of form, of line, of colour, of design, art is more fundamental than ever. Our society has given rise to a general aestheticization. All forms of culture, not excluding anti-cultural ones, are promoted, and all models of representation and anti-representation are taken on board. In the postmodern media and consumer society, everything becomes an image, a sign, a spectacle, a trans-aesthetic object, just as everything also becomes trans-economic, trans-political, and transsexual. This materialization of aesthetics is accompanied by a desperate attempt to simulate art, to replicate and mix previous artistic forms and styles, and to produce ever more images and artistic objects. However, Baudrillard mentions that the kind of art that is being produced is just images in which there is nothing to see. Moreover, Baudrillard talks about extreme phenomena. This term refers to phenomena such as AIDS, cancer, terrorism, computer viruses, etc., which are a form of evil in the sense that they tend to disrupt the flow of systems. AIDS disrupts the flow of sexual promiscuity, cancer disrupts the flow of genetic programming, terrorism disrupts the flow of political economy, and so forth. These disruptions, moreover, may be the result on the part of these systems of a sort of homeostatic tendency to preserve the system itself from even worse evils. Drugs, for example, prevent the tyranny of rationality, the terrorism, the tyranny of political consensus, AIDS, the absolute tyranny of sexual promiscuity, etc. Mark Poster, his editor and popularizer, candidly points out that Baudrillard's writing is open to several criticisms. He writes about particular experiences, television images, as if nothing else in society mattered, extrapolating a bleak view of the world from that limited base. He ignores contradictory evidence. Physicist Alan Sokal argues that Baudrillard employs a quasi-scientific vocabulary. David Porush argues it's hard to resist Jean Baudrillard's hyperbolic torrent of brilliant connectionism. I couldn't disagree more. Even though nobody can doubt Baudrillard's credibility about his work, there are always writers, scientists, etc., who do not agree with some of his aspects or even at all. As for this book, there is a great concern about usage of arbitrary scientific vocabulary and unilateral aspects of situations, ignoring the contradictory aspects.
Baudrillard refers extensively to the change of art as it was defined at the time. He claims that art, where things obey a higher set of rules, no longer exists. He says that we experience a change which was inevitable, since the idea that art represents a utopia had been immobilized and paralyzed by its own image and its own riches. He quotes, "Where there is stasis, there is metastasis," and goes on to correlate art, in its paralyzed form, with a form of cancer. If we tried to extend this thought from art to architecture as a form of art, this would imply an architecture that is unconventional and does not abide to pre-existing rules. The change in architecture occurred with the shift from modernism to postmodernism. If modernism was the stasis, postmodernism would be the metastasis, breaking away from the strict norms established by its predecessor. The book was written during the last years of postmodernism, and even though it sometimes seems to converge with postmodernist theory, Baudrillard, much like Robert Venturi, doesn't classify himself as a postmodernist. As far as Baudrillard's ideas about architecture are concerned, he believed that buildings, as well as the act of destroying them, can be symbolical in nature. As monumental buildings represent their respective regimes, so does their demolition represent their downfall. This opinion is made clear in his controversial response to the events of 9/11. The Twin Towers are signs of closure and redoubling, not of a system that can still surpass itself with original edifices. The twinness of the towers remains for Baudrillard the perfect embodiment of today's world order, but there is no longer, at the macro level, two superpowers mirroring one another's irrationality. Binary regulation at this level is over in the triumph of global capitalism. Moreover, Baudrillard mentions that we manufacture a profusion of images in which there is nothing to see because they neither conceal nor reveal anything. If we were to translate Baudrillard's ideas to architecture, it would be a residence designed around a life scenario, with specific roles appointed to each of the tenants. Next, it would be up to the personality of the tenants to accept or deny that role, if they will conform to it or attempt to redefine it. On the contrary, in an anti-Baudrillard scenario, we would have a strict spatial situation where apartment blocks would be arranged around an internal courtyard that allows views through each apartment, thus encouraging surveillance.
The book has two parts. The first part has no title, whereas the second is titled Radical Otherness. Both parts include underlying apophthegms of the writer. All the chapters are parts of a central theme, even though their relation to each other and to the central theme is not always clearly perceived. The text was not written in the form of a conventional essay, and the usage of first-person plural shows an attempt of the writer to bring closer the reader with events that unite them. One could say that Baudrillard attempts to engage in a debate with the reader by directly questioning their personal life and experiences. The methods that the writer uses are definition, description, division and classification, analogy, and cause and effect, logical syllogism. As anyone knows who has read Baudrillard, by evil he does not mean evil in a moral or ethical sense, but rather that principle which is antithetical to the smooth functioning of our hypermodern systems. First, AIDS, cancer, terrorism, computer viruses, etc. are examples of extreme phenomena which are a form of evil in the sense that they tend to disrupt the flow of systems. So, the title is very appropriate to the context, since the writer speaks about the dysfunction that describes systems of modern society, even though its meaning is not pretty clear before reading the book. Is the contents presentation appropriate? Baudrillard uses italics and capitals in order to highlight terms or his considerations in order to keep the reader's attention. As for his way of writing, the arbitrary use of scientific vocabulary outside his jurisdiction, combined with his extensive use of figurative speech, often render Baudrillard incomprehensible, and his train of thought is hard to follow. Is the book's presentation appropriate? The book's cover is minimal, and one could say that the book has no intention to attract attention by using impressive design. As for its content, there is only usage of text with no images, photographs.